is that okay, great. I'll just briefly reintroduce myself and I'll share my screen in a moment, but just so you can see my face a little bit more for a few. Um, the context of this trauma-informed crisis de-escalation training is that initially I developed it with the help of some resources from when I was at the Center for Youth and Family Solutions, which is the agency that was kind of my it was my home in child welfare and therapy for 5.5 years. I was a therapist and a supervisor there. And I developed this training first specifically for transitional foster homes, which in those types of homes, there was just a lot of escalation because they were having youth in care who had higher levels of needs. And then from there, it expanded to giving it to other foster parents, and then it expanded to giving it to the agency. And since then, I've been able to bring it to a little bit more like community spaces. So I'm excited to bring it here. Let me share my screen and I can do a little bit more of an introduction about where um, this comes from. As I share my screen, I'm not completely sure if I'll be able to still see the chat, I realized. Um, oh, good, I can see the chat. Okay, lovely. Because I was going to say that I will have some questions throughout. I have a lot to share today. I will try to end us 15 minutes before the end time at 11 so that we can do some question and answer, and that part won't be recorded. But in the meantime, I will have some questions, and you can drop answers in the chat just to have you be thinking about what these skills might look like for you. And if there is ever a point where you want to answer a question out loud, feel free to just unmute. Feel free to interrupt me if I'm getting on a tangent and don't see a chat pop up. So just a little bit more about me here. I recently did make the transition into private practice mostly because I especially want to work with teenagers and adults. That's where I feel like is my sweet spot with trauma work. So I made this transition so that I could really dive into that like specialty. Some of the background that gets pulled into this training is I have some specific trauma training in EMDR, which is a trauma treatment, polyvagal theory, which is a nervous system based treatment that just or the kind of lens that helps us understand the body's response to trauma. So I have some of that integrated into here. ARC framework, attachment, regulation, and competency is a framework that I used a lot, especially working with traumatized youth and families, trauma-focused CBT and parts work. So this training specifically pulls from some of those areas, and then it also pulls from a couple like specific resources. So I just wanted to cite them here. I did a training called Trauma-Informed De-Escalation, Calming the Eye of the Storm. And then some of the crisis curve that I'll talk through is from a book called Oppositional, Defiant, and Disruptive Children and Adults. And even though it is in the book is about that category, really it's more broad. I think that it's applicable to even kids who have what maybe looks like oppositional defiant behaviors, but really it's traumatized reactions. I think the idea of the crisis curve and some of our responses to it is similar. And I also integrate some TBRI, which is, I just think, a really helpful framework as well for working with traumatized youth. I just want to start by saying thank you for being here. Thank you for what you do. I imagine that most of the people watching are foster parents or adoptive parents. I know there may also be some other just interested community folks here too. But just the fact that you're here and wanting to develop the skills in crisis de-escalation and learning how to regulate yourself and youth is it's just really valuable. A preface I want to give is that it is possible that some of the things that I share today might be things that you already know, because if you're in this line of work, you probably have seen a lot, done a lot. Some of you might know more than I do about like some aspects of parenting youth because I come from the therapist lens. So even if there are things that are a refresher, I just always view that still as a helpful recentering. Even if I go through a training and it's things that I've learned before, I tend to still leave with like a new way to focus in on those. So I hope that even if still you're like, yeah, I know about fight flight, like we can still pull that into then our like daily work. I'm going to go through some topics that I'll be covering today. I may not have time for all of them. And actually, I don't even have safety planning on here anymore because I've never done this presentation and had time for safety planning. So we're going to talk about what a crisis is and some goals of de-escalation, the experience of the child and the experience of the caregiver. And that's about the first half. Like, I really want to just spend some time in understanding the brain and trauma responses and like what's happening in a moment of escalation for both youth and for us because we're being impacted by it as well. And then for the second half is the crisis curve. We'll talk about specific verbal and nonverbal techniques, some specific thoughts about aggression. And I'm not sure that I'll have time for problem solving either, especially since we want to have time for question and answers. But I'll get through as much as I can. Um, just a little discussion question to start us off, because I think that a moment of recentering is helpful. So we're talking about skills, but we're also talking about like us as people and our children that we work with as people. So you can share in the chat if you want to, or just internally reflect like what got you interested in working with youth and care, and what keeps you interested in doing this work as foster parents or adoptive parents, even when there's a lot of hardships and difficulties. And here's kind of a list of just a wide range of values that might play a role in why we do this work, or things that matter to us in doing this work. We have a lot of compassion. All of you have probably lots of compassion and empathy and hope. We might value and want to instill in our children respect and hard work and honesty. And the reason I think it's helpful to reflect on these things, I have kind of some questions here that we can think through, is that oops, sorry, I didn't mean to click the next slide. It's a little hard. I have like the picture on the side here. But our values can help us recognize why we keep doing good work, even when we feel burnt out, overwhelmed, or angry or stressed, especially if we are dealing with crisis situations. That can be a fast track to overwhelm and burnout. So coming back to values helps us recenter. It can also help us understand our triggers, which we'll talk about for like our own triggers of like what happens in a moment of crisis that might bring up our own dysregulation. We can understand, like, if we really value respect and we feel disrespected, or if we really value honesty and we're being lied to, like those things can be really hard for us and might make it harder to de-escalate in the moment. And it can help us recenter when we start to get frustrated by things that if we step back, we realize it's not in line with our core values. We've got sharing in the chat that my spouse and I always wanted kids in the home, but don't have bio kids. We realized how important this is for kids in the community. The kids taught us so much. It's hard, but we love what we do. Yeah, there's so much that we take away from the good work. Yeah, you all have very important jobs, and it makes such a huge impact to have safe homes for kids facing a lot of instability. So here's one that I especially think would be helpful to just have pop in the chat, to even think about like some experiences that you've had. And however, it could just be a couple words, but what are some situations that either like that you think about when we're talking about crisis de-escalation? What are things that pop into your mind of like times you've had to de-escalate or moments you need to calm a crisis? Just what does this look like in your lives and your homes? I can think about as a therapist having kids come in, not wanting to participate in certain activities, and then that can escalate into anger, temper tantrums when kids get triggered, disagreement or disrespect. I think we especially get stressed when things have like a risk of physical, like if things start getting thrown, we're thinking we're de-escalating. Not being able to regulate emotions for non-preferred activities. Yes, when they don't want to do a certain task and we need them to do a certain task for sure. Physical aggression with teens. Yeah. I'm sure we've got quite a range here of different like age groups that you work with. So I'm going to try to there's different things throughout the presentation. I think we'll focus on different ages. Okay. Feel free to still, and just as we go on, feel free to pop anything that pops in your mind in the chat. So just some examples here. Child starting to see, like, these are moments that we might already be using de-escalation. When they start to seem irritated, attention-seeking behavior. That's a good point. We might need to know what that pattern is and how that might escalate. Like if they're doing things that might feel annoying to the adult, but it's their attempt to like connect, but that can escalate if we, just depending on how it goes. Child refusing tasks or direction, if the child is escalating or the adults are escalating, emotions that can lead to dangerous behaviors. And ultimately, my main point here is that even during calm moments, we are constantly de escalating by preventing escalation with things that we do just on a day-to-day basis. When things are calm, or even if we're just a little bit over that calm state and that like slightly irritable state, we're using de-escalation. So, for a moment, think about the experience of a crisis and ponder, like, for you, we kind of did this a little bit, but like, what kinds of situations are most overwhelming to you? What is your internal experience? What might the internal experience be of the child or teen in crisis? And what is typically our goal? And that's what I'm going to define here in a little bit is what the goal is of crisis de-escalation. So some definitions just to put some terms to this. A time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger when we have to solve problems and make decisions very quickly. We need to like beyond because there's sometimes a level of risk that comes with escalation, depending on how escalated we are. It's an acute, so very like fast, short, emotional upset. Um, it's emotionally charged, and often it involves the fight, flight, or freeze response, which I'll get into a little bit more soon. So, thinking about our goals. The first goal is safety. Can the child be safe in the setting? Can anyone else who's around? I know that in some of the questions that I got ahead of time, it was about like, what do we, oh, some of you might have other kids in the home and we might be trying to de-escalate one child, but we have other kids who are around too. And sometimes they need to be kept safe, or they might even further escalate the situation if they're trying to help or have trouble stepping aside. So can everyone be kept safe? Can you be kept safe as the adult? And if not, what do we need to do to ensure safety? I think that the other like goal that kind of goes along with safety is our first goal is to bring regulation back to baseline, which means we're really focused on how do we primarily help the child or teen or adult get back to a place where they're calm enough to be able to like discuss or come back to whatever issue was at hand that might have led to the escalation. So some perspectives to keep in mind that are just going to be like a lens as we talk. De-escalation goes against everything that our body wants to do during a stressful situation. Like when we are facing someone in crisis or someone who's upset or yelling or screaming or throwing things, we don't want to try to calm them. We want to protect ourselves or react or like we have our own fight flight response that's going to get activated then, and that means we want to try to fight off the danger or get away. So when we try to implement these skills, it takes a lot of active work for us because it's not natural. To reach safety, our goal is we want to send a message to the dysregulated child that we aren't a danger to them, that we, like their fight flight system might be activated. So we want to show that we are not a threat to that system. So some of the verbal and nonverbal skills that we'll talk about will help do that. And in the de-escalation training that I went through, some piece of language that I'll be pulling into this training that I really liked is that de-escalation is an art and not a science. It is a free flowing, we don't have like clear cut answers. It might change day to day. It might change moment to moment where we have to be able to flow with it and use like our body language, our words in ways that aren't like there's no great formula. Things that you might do one day might not work the next, and vice versa. So I'll pull in some more of that as we continue. So we're going to spend some time talking about the experience of the child in crisis. And just some thoughts about like stress specifically that our youth in care are under. Some of these can be applied to adoptive children too, or biological children that we might be caring for also, but just some things that play a role in their like baseline level of stress. They face emotions of fear, anger, hurt, and disappointment. They may feel a lack of control, which leads to chronic stress that gets held in the nervous system. They have their own trauma and attachment wounds that they might be working through. There might be adaptations to new homes, or even like respite homes. There's a lot of shifting that they're dealing with. Visiting biological parents can bring up a wide range of emotion, positive, mixed, negative. They may not have words for what they feel. A lot of trauma can just be stored in the body and held non-verbally. So it might even be hard for them to label, communicate, and identify what they feel, which can just be stressful in itself. And then even knowing if they're in a temporary placement, that in itself can be a piece of instability that leads to an like ongoing feeling of stress and uncertainty. And a lot of these things, you already know this is what I mean. So a couple thoughts specifically about the role of stress in crisis, because we're going to be talking about fight, flight, and stress plays a role in that. Some stress is healthy. Like even we often give a bad rap to the fight flight system, but it exists for a reason to keep us safe. So stress helps us be safe. It helps us get things done. It motivates us to move our bodies. So for our kids, like there's that stress exists in them for a reason, but some stress gets to a point of being unhealthy, especially for traumatized youth. They might be living in that fight flight mode. And when they're facing survival responses, their reactions can become regressive, like going back to basics of more like younger responses that like their again, nervous system might inherently know, and cognitively we might see them as they look older, or they, maybe are at an older age and should know or be able to respond in certain ways. But in moments of stress, they might actually be acting more from a 3 or 4 year old perspective, because that's how their body's holding their stress, and they revert back to that younger age. So sometimes even that lens can be helpful of like, okay, I know they're an 8 year old, but in this moment when they're facing stress, they are acting from a 3 year old's body. And that can help us even respond in different ways to help them regulate. So I'm going to note like difference between what we see and what might be underneath. A lot of times on the outside, we're seeing more like anger or aggressive behaviors. We see destruction, defiance, opposition. A lot of times we're seeing externalized behaviors from their stress response. And these can be especially triggering for us, like the defiance, vindictiveness, hurtful language, carelessness. Those things can be hard to see. Underneath, there might be a lot of other things going on that they, again, can't verbalize. There might be hurt feelings or betrayal, loss or anticipated loss, anxiety, sadness, the lack of control. They might be experiencing sensory overwhelm or other forms of neurodivergence that make their brain function differently in ways they might not be cognizant of. And kind of similar at the bottom here, other factors that might play a role: neurodiversity, attention deficits, stressors we might not even know about. Maybe for older teens, there could be substance use involved, potentially even psychosis. So has anyone heard of the 3-tier brain, the hand model of the brain by Dan Siegel? I guess it's hard to ask this question, but I guess in the chat, if anyone has heard of it, do a little shout out. Have not. It's fun when people haven't, because then I get to share. This is a model that you could share with your kids that you work with, teach them about it, to even talk about what happens in these moments. When I've worked with kids, I have taught them this so we can talk about like flipping our lid, and it's a fun visual that makes it feel a little more understandable. So you all can see me, right? I know I've got this. Yeah, okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so if we think of our hand as our brain and body, the wrist would be like our vagus nerve. And when I mentioned polyvagal theory earlier, that term comes from, it has to do with the vagus nerve, which is the longest nerve in the body. It's connected to every organ, and a lot of trauma comes back to the vagus nerve and how trauma gets held in there. So the vagus nerve sends feelings from the brain and sends messages back and forth. The brain stem is kind of our most basic functioning in our brain that controls like the heart, lungs, like basic um, body responses to things. Um, the limbic system, if we think of our thumb as a limbic system, that's more of our like emotional part of our brain, and like our fear brain, our like taking what's happening and putting emotions to it. Also attachment regulation, so like connection happens here. And then if we flip our fingers down, this is like the front part of our brain here, our thinking brain, our prefrontal cortex. And this is the part of the brain that lets us problem solve. It's our rational part of the brain. It's how we make decisions. It's how, like, if we talk to a kid about like what's the right thing to do and they know that answer, that's their thinking brain that's online. And that's the part of the brain when we often say like the brain doesn't fully develop until age 25. Like, especially that part of the brain is really what we're often referring to. I talked about the emotional part of the brain, like in the back, the amygdala that manages emotions, how we feel in relationships, and then the survival part of the brain, the most primitive and instinctive part that is just trying to take care of our basic human needs and survival. So, the idea here that is helpful to teach kids about is that when we get upset, often it's our lid flips is what it's called. So this thinking brain goes offline, and what's online is all of this stuff that helps us survive and helps us feel, and that's great. But in a moment of stress, then we might not have access to like what's right, what's wrong, how do I make good decisions, what do I want, what does my family want? We're just thinking, how do I survive in this moment? So if we can go in with that lens, and if we can help kids recognize that, then it helps us, for one, take a step back and recognize, like, okay, that part of their brain is not online right now. So that means I'm dealing with the emotion part, the survival part. What do I do with that? And then we can focus on how do we help the thinking brain come back online. And a lot of de-escalation strategies, a lot of like regulation and coping strategies that kids might learn in counseling or that we might teach them help that. But there's certain things that might not be like we might not be able to use logic or reason with kids in these moments of saying like what's right, what's wrong, because that part of their brain isn't online. So I'll as we go through, I'll continue to share different like strategies that might help the thinking brain get back online, but just this lens is a helpful start. Um, so to talk through the fight flight response a little bit more, the body has a split second unconscious process that helps us constantly scan for danger. It's called neuroception. So our kids, and especially kids who've been through trauma, they have a really active neuroception response where they are constantly scanning without even being aware of it, but their body is scanning for danger. And the body can't always tell what's truly dangerous or not because of everything that they've experienced throughout their lives. Danger might mean a lot of different things, and the body might be reminded of danger by things that actually aren't dangerous. So the body immediately tries to tell, can I survive this? If the body thinks it can survive, then it becomes activated. It goes into that fight flight response. Okay, there's a danger, but I can survive it. So I'm going to either try to fight it off or I'm going to try to run, and I can do something to get through it. If the body feels like it can't survive, then it might shut down and enter that freeze response we talk about where it like can't move. We might see kids like flop or just zone out or like dissociate, completely shut down. That's the body saying, I can't get through this. And it's not a conscious decision. It's just their body reacting to the input it's getting. So I already talked about this, but the thinking brain becomes inaccessible and they might revert back to behaviors that they've done to just help them survive, even things they've like maybe unlearned, but old behaviors that they used to engage in to survive might come back. I'm in the part of the presentation where I'm talking a lot, so there will be a little bit more questions soon, but this is kind of the crux of our baseline that I'm developing here. This part's a little wordy, but I just want to kind of show a visual of that. This is polyvagal theory, as I mentioned, understanding our nervous system. So down at the bottom, we've got the green social engagement system. This is when we feel safe and connected and curious and open. And then above it in the red is that activation, that fight flight. I can fight off something. My body's getting ready to fight. And then at the top is shut down. And why I like this visual and just want to share is that some of our kids might not have spent much time at all in this social engagement connected system if they've been living in trauma or transitioning home to home or not, or with attachment figures who loved them but weren't always safe, their body might be always living in this sympathetic fight flight response. Which means that sometimes with a lot of like crisis situations, I'll hear like caregivers say like it went from 0 to 100, and it might have looked that way, but the child might have already been living at 50 all the time. Like they might be in the state of fight flight. And then when it looks like it goes to 100, really they were just activating further from the system that was already activated. So just a couple more thoughts here. When we have a child who's been through trauma, the fight, flight, freeze system becomes overactivated, like a go-to button that the brain relies on and clicks on very quickly. The brain might live in that activated state. And I like this phrase of anything can be a tiger, which means that like if the body perceives something as a threat, if the body thinks it's a threat, the body's going to respond based on that perception, not really based on reality. So like let's say dropping a child off at school, maybe like for a new child in your home and you're bringing the kid to school. And we know that that's not an unsafe situation, but if they have attachment wounds, it's a new place, like the body's responding based on this feels very unsafe. And again, we can't like logic or reason that through. We have to help them feel safe, typically through more like somatic or body or like co-regulation activities. Um, Another visual, sorry if I'm overdoing it with this, but I just think it's an important place to start. In the top left corner, we've got brain process under typical conditions. So like for adults or people who have either haven't experienced the same kind of trauma or have like worked through it, we will be able to take in input, interpret it, process, look at our options, make a plan and act. And we can go through all of those steps when new information comes in. And in a moment of danger, this is the system that we all have that's built in. We skip all these steps of processing, evaluating options, and planning, and we just act. And it's good that we have that ability. We use it during crisis situations, but with repeated stress, that alarm system route becomes the main road, and it becomes just what the body does every time there's a sense of danger, or even anything. Sometimes the body might be living in that state. Um, it's worth noting as well. I just include this because especially a lot of kids in foster care have experienced relational trauma and thus attachment wounds and attachment trauma. Oftentimes, escalation and dysregulation can be related to attachment for traumatized youth. So think about some of these examples. These aren't all signifiers of attachment wounds because there could be other things playing a role in this. There could be ADHD or certain types of anxiety. So it's not a clear cut all or nothing, but just a potential lens is if we have a child who has like great behaviors at school, but is getting escalated at home, or even vice versa. A child is a great first few weeks in a new placement before difficult behaviors start. A child only has escalated behaviors when they are alone. A child only has certain escalation patterns with a certain person. A lot of those could be attachment reactions. And sometimes we might think that it's frustrating because like they can manage their emotions. I think I missed the quotation mark on the other side of the can, but a child can manage their emotions because they can do it in one place or we've seen them do it before. And keeping in mind that the contextual role of attachment and just how trauma might respond differently in different situations plays a role in that, where they might have been able to access the skills to regulate in one situation, but they may not have access to those same skills when certain part of their attachment system gets activated. Um, any if anyone has any thoughts or questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. I know I've kind of been going for a while here. I will keep going, but if anything pops in the chat, I'll pause because I've got it up here. A couple more perspectives to keep in mind. The reactions during these dysregulated moments is often a form of communication of a nonverbal experience. So viewing all behaviors as communication, they are trying to tell us something, even like the note of like attention seeking behaviors. Sometimes those can be frustrating but we can look and see what are they trying to communicate through that. They're communicating that there's some sense of like a lack of connection or maybe a low self-worth or some kind of need that they might not be able to verbalize, but we can go in with curiosity of, I wonder what's happening inside of them. I wonder what they might be trying to communicate. I've already said some of these things. The last point I think is worth noting that how we view behaviors, and that's why I wanted to spend a lot of time here, impacts our responses. I know that on my worst days as a therapist, it is when I have a child who's like acting out and I'm taking it as they don't want to listen to me, they like don't respect me, and that might feel very true in those moments. And then I'm acting out of that place of like it's a it brings up something in me, my values of wanting to be respected and heard. And what if I can step back and view it through the lens of that they are having an internal reaction to something, then I can at least go in with more curiosity and empathy and less reactivity myself. Okay, this next part, now we're going to spend a little bit of time on our experience. And this quote that I put here, before we can de-escalate, we have to regulate. So before we can even talk about the skills of like of the crisis curve that we'll talk about and verbal and nonverbal techniques, it's hard to use those if we aren't in a place of our own regulation. So we'll talk through some different things that we can do. Um, some of the stress that you all might be under. Foster parents, parents of all kinds are carrying a lot. Maybe we might be adjusting to a new child in the home and not knowing what to expect from them. It's a whole new person. Feeling overwhelmed. You feel responsible for so much going on with the kids, for their safety, for their development, for their emotional growth. We might feel like we failed if we don't know how to handle something challenging. I at least have experienced that as a therapist sometimes of like having a really rough session and feeling like I let them down or let the family down. We might have had previous experiences with youth that lead us to feel triggered ourselves. Like maybe we've had a really tough crisis and that gets brought back up. We might fear worst case scenarios. We might fear making a mistake or fear something bad happening. A lot of times, especially if we have like an escalated youth or teen, we might like worry about them getting hurt, them running away, what happens. And just a lot of us carry our own traumas and our own complex backgrounds that affect how we view and handle difficult situations. So understanding our own triggers is helpful, kind of like understanding our own values is helpful and they're connected. We all have actions or situations that trigger our own anger, frustration, or anxiety. And we can notice internally, I kind of asked this earlier, but like, what are some common patterns with us? And these are some examples. Maybe being lied to, feeling or being disrespected, feeling unappreciated. You do a lot, so it can be difficult when you don't feel like that is seen. Um, Defiant behaviors and a lack of control, and many, many others. Let's take a moment and share in the chat. What are some of your signs that you're getting dysregulated or triggered or escalated in a moment of stress? And these can be like internal warning signs, visible warning signs, heart rate. Yeah. That's that limbic system at work. What else? Getting hot, raising my voice or speaking faster. Yep. I feel flustered. I'm sure my tone changes if I'm with a child that's acting up. Yeah, eye roll, sighing, looking up at the ceiling in frustration. My body language might shift. Speaking quiet or tone. That is if that's your body's response, that's actually a helpful response since that can help de-escalate. But it might be more of a like the withdrawal that like shut down even. I'm not typically an angry person, so when I start to get angry, I know I'm just dysregulated. Yeah. We might not feel like ourselves. Less laughing or lightness as a reaction, that's a good point to mention because that like laughing and lightness as a reaction can even be de-escalating in itself. And if we know that typically that helps, it might be hard to access in a moment of crisis, but we might want to be mindful of that and see like, is that something we can then pull in since we know that it helps connect relationally? Okay, good. You already got some of these. I just wanted to throw out some other examples. These are like some natural body responses to stress. Heart beating faster, might get tight. We might yell, our voice gets louder. Our stomach might get tight or upset. Our breath might change. So self-regulation is going to be important, and I want to spend a little time on some specific strategies that we can use before crises, during, after, to manage our own reactions. Want to I've already kind of gone through this, but like we just want to be aware of all these different things that might impact us, so that we can care for our youth. So these are 4 different categories that we'll go through, and I'll have a little time at the end for us to share. Either this might be a moment out loud, because we'll be about like halfway through probably when I finish this portion. So if anyone wants to share out loud specific things that might be helpful for you, we can also share in the chat too. We'll talk through advanced preparation, so things that we do before crisis situations to help us prepare and like be in a regulated state. In the pocket strategy, so things that like literally in the moment you can like pull out of your pocket, like metaphorically, but that you can use right in the moment of a crisis. Recovery strategies, which I think sometimes we might reach that shutdown state of that like collapse because we're exhausted, but we want to do things that help us get back to a state of safety. And then just ongoing things, which is hard when you're extremely busy and carrying so many different buckets and hats, but it's still important to try to do things to care for ourselves. So 3 different categories here of things that we can do as advanced preparation. And these are things that you can either do for yourself, or you could also even loop in your like youth or teenager to do these for themselves too. But I especially want you to think about doing it for you. But think about what's kind of a regulation toolkit for yourself. Are there any like things that you can have on hand that are accessible when you're out and about or in your home in certain places that regulate you? Visual reminders are little things that bring you a sense of that term ventral was like the bottom, like safety level on that chart we looked at. So little things that bring a little sense of like connection and comfort that you can pull up in your mind, even if it's a visual space, a favorite vacation spot, or a made up place that you'd love to travel someday. Those are things that help our system shift back into safety. I like to encourage all of us to be okay with pausing. Sometimes a crisis requires an immediate response. If there is danger, physical risk, sometimes we're going to have to respond right away. But there are sometimes other situations where we can pause and not give a reaction immediately and take a moment to reflect internally. If you're getting called into somewhere, it's okay can you wait 1 minute to give yourself a moment in the car to breathe and connect with yourself? Notice what's happening inside. Notice if you're feeling triggered. Asking ourselves what some of these questions we talked about earlier that bring up curiosity. What is the person communicating through these behaviors? What emotions could be behind the behaviors that help me recognize it's not just them disrespecting me or defying my authority? It is something else going on that may not have anything to do with me right now. So giving ourselves these moments to use some kind of regulation skill, which we'll talk about more in a second, and pause and reflect can be helpful. In the pocket strategies, I'm listing some examples, but this list could be very long, and you might have many of your own that you can pull. But these are little things that we can do in a stressful moment to regulate our bodies. This first set, the shaking, humming, rocking, swaying, tapping, some of those might seem kind of strange. You know, like, I don't want to shake. But these are things that help the body move from the nervous system state of fight flight into safety. There are things that we can even talk with our kids about. Some of them might even do it naturally. You might see your kids like swaying back and forth or like bouncing up and down. Some of those things might be actually their body's way to attempt to regulate. The tapping, that bilateral I wrote, this is, I mentioned I'm trained in EMDR, which is a trauma treatment, and it uses bilateral, so both sides of the body movements to help reprocess. But that tool can also be used to regulate the back and forth tapping, especially slow. So you could just tap back and forth on your thighs while you're standing there, and you might notice your nervous system slowing down a bit. Little hums to yourself. Controlled breathing sometimes, and when I teach kids, sometimes they don't really get the idea that like deep breaths isn't about like like a deep breath. Really, controlled breathing focuses even more on like the exhale. The exhale is the part of the breath that slows the body down. So if we can focus on having a really long exhale, that will slow down our body. Can do muscle relaxation. I don't know if anyone mentioned like tightness. Maybe I just mentioned that, but like we can, in the moment, focus on just one body part that we like relax those muscles. Maybe we tense them and then relax them and notice the difference. Scan the body and notice where you're holding it. We can use grounding. This is even a skill. I'm getting a little bit into like an intervention here, but when I've had escalated youth that I've been like interacting with in the moment, sometimes it doesn't always work, but sometimes I've used grounding to try to like distract and help divert their attention to something else. So we can either use our senses, or I might be like, I'm going to name all the circles I can see in the room. I'm going to name everything blue I can see in the room, and doing that. And sometimes they'll play along, sometimes they won't. But even just by doing that is shifting their attention to something sensory. So we can do that too. Stepping away for a break when it's safe. I know I had gotten the question about like what we do when there's like when we can't step away or when we have like other kids there. And I do have a slide later on that will touch on that piece of like just some things we can try to build up ahead of time to make it easier for us to step away. And even if you're stepping away, like we might still be nearby. Maybe we're like, we step into the hallway for a moment, or we even just turn and face the window for a moment to like see outside, like finding little ways to get a slight break. And then self-talk. Are there things that we want to remind ourselves of that like, I know that this is not personal right now, or I know that this is their trauma speaking and not me. I encourage everybody, adults and kids, to practice these strategies when we're calm so that our brains can build this habit up, because it's harder to pull out a strategy like this in a moment of crisis when we haven't like built it up as a routine. So doing these things with your youth or just on your own can help it feel stronger and like your body remembers it better. Recovery strategies. These this could, again, like this list could go far on. So I'm just listing out some examples, but like give yourself some time after a crisis to try to regulate. You might have other responsibilities, work or kids that you have to do. So some of these could be really like small things you can do while you're with them. Wash your hands, engage with some sort of comfort item, a nice lotion, a nice smell. Try to do something physical, go for a walk, do some, even like the shaking, and I mentioned that earlier, but like if you bounce on your toes and like kind of let your body shake, it's actually, if we look at animals in the wild, after like an animal gets attacked, there's some really interesting videos of the animal, like they shake before they get up and walk away. It is part of the body's natural desire to like resolve a stress response is to shake. So we can even help kids do that, shake it out, and they might feel better after. Wait to talk to the child. Sorry, adult client is left in here from a different version of this presentation, but like wait to talk to the child until you feel calm enough. And at some point, you may express your needs or emotions to the person to address what happened to find some resolution. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then ongoing self-care. This is always like one of the hardest slides to share because I know everybody's busy and you may not have time to get a full night's sleep. You may be always on the go and just juggling a lot. But at the same time, we do know that these things help us be closer to that state of safety and connection. And sometimes a lack of these things can lead us to be in a more ongoing state of stress. So if there are things you can do to try to like do things you enjoy, to spend some moments of mindfulness, even if it's like when you're in the car listening to a mindfulness, getting therapy or counseling for yourself, for your kids, spend time with supportive people, set boundaries when you need to, say no to things if you need to. That ongoing self-care just helps us be at a better baseline. So I'm going to ask here, discussion time. Are you could answer either of these questions. Either like, are there some that are hard to do for yourself? Are there some that are there some that you particularly want to use? You could either share out loud or just drop answers in the chat. Like, what are specific things that you want to try to do for your own self-regulation? Struggle most with recovery because I move quickly to the next thing. Yeah. Well, there's always so much to do. So it's like sometimes that next thing is calling and allowing ourselves to try to wait on that and let it sit is hard. It may be possible sometimes. I've always tried to get my kids to take deep breaths, but didn't realize that blowing out was most important. Yeah. Oh, good. I for kids like birthday candle, like low and slow, blowing out a birthday candle. Be willing to give up being right. Oh man, that's hard. And that's the logical brain where like in that moment they might not even be able to admit that they were wrong. Redirecting to other tasks or conversation. Yeah. Both for us mentally and for youth as well. Um, Sometimes just a break from the stressful thing. And the kids might not want to do that. They might want, like, if there's something that they're upset about, they might try to keep coming back to it. So we might have to try to be really diligent about giving it a break. I'll have some specifics on that soon. I'm going to try the physical tapping or shaking, trying to find what works and modeling it for the kids. Yeah, that's great. The modeling is good. When I've had escalated youth, sometimes like they won't engage with me with what I'm doing, but I'll do it and say like I'm going to use this skill. You can participate or not, but then out loud, I've had like there was like a 4-year-old basic almost destroying a classroom and I said I'm just going to take 10 deep breaths and I talked through it. I'm breathing in one, I'm breathing out. And I just did that for like a full minute and they were calmer by the end. They didn't take any of the breaths, but they were calmer. Being able to not raise my voice to their current level during an escalation. Yes, that's great. It's hard, but if we can, I'll have this on a slide later, but like the idea of saying like, I want to talk about this, but when your voice is as calm as mine, then that challenges us to use that calm voice. And then it helps them realize that they're being loved. We feel like we don't have to be. Okay. Any others still pop up? That's great. Um, all right, so I'm going to talk through, I'm shifting into, for this next part, getting into some of the more tangible, like what's the escalation of a crisis and what are different things that we might do at different points of the crisis. And then verbal and nonverbal techniques for recovery. I will try a more active physical plan to allow them to release. Yes. And I think that physical piece of it's really helpful. Like even it's so hard in the winter when it's cold, but like if there's things we can get outside and do, even like One really regulating thing can even be like lifting, like if there's like things that they can do that involve some heaviness, that can be like helpful for kids with like sensory sensitivity. All right, so here's a visual, and I'm going to get into some of these specifics, but thinking through we don't just have that moment of crisis. Often we have an escalation that gets there and a de-escalation after. And like I said, sometimes it feels like it goes from 0 to 100, and sometimes it does. Sometimes it just is like out of the blue, and we might not even see the heating up or increased conflict stage. I think that with this whole presentation, ultimately a lot of it is like we do our best. Like we try to notice what we can, and we try to like pay attention, be mindful, and sometimes we might be able to notice when there's a triggered stage that maybe we wouldn't have noticed before because it just seemed normal or because we were going through the motions. Um, so thinking through some of these different states, the base calm state is what I talked about on and showed you on that chart before of like that base down green at the bottom. It's called in our nervous system ventral energy, where we feel regulated, connected, and safe. Some like I've talked about, some of our kids might not really spend much time here. Sometimes safety can even feel like a trigger in itself because often trauma happens in a place of safety. Like we might have felt safe in a relationship and then something bad happened. So now when we feel safe in a relationship, we become afraid that something bad will happen. So like even this base calm state can be complicated. And that's why sometimes like we might have that honeymoon period in a new placement where like it's fine for a while, but then when it starts to feel too comfortable, it might feel scary. Okay, so anyways, the triggered state, that's when we might start to see some small clues. Something has felt like a tiger. Something has activated their nervous system response. There might be a tangible threat. It might be being told to do something that they didn't want to do. I'm sure that happens a lot where it's like, and there's some kind of activation from them of like maybe it feels now out of their control or they feel like their freedom has been threatened. So we notice that there might be little signs of like irritability. There might be starting to like nudge things around or tap toes. So whatever you know your own youth best, and you know what signs might indicate feeling a little triggered. Um, the next stage is above that, like when we're actually starting to visibly see like conflict growing, the person's getting angry, maybe they're starting to yell or yeah, or argue. And then when we're in the actual crisis peak, this is when like there's damage. It's a risk of harm. So sometimes we might have situations where it doesn't even fully get to the crisis. We might be like having stress because we're having like conflict and arguments, but I would say that that crisis stage is when it's like risk of damage to someone, and we need to be prioritizing safety. And then we think about the aftermath, where there's even three. We could break it down into three different stages. Where de-escalation is like the person's still activated but starting to get calmer. Settlement is not fully in crisis, but we're starting to like access that thinking brain again, but not fully at baseline yet. Yes, I can. Someone asked if I can send these slides. Yeah, I can send this whole PowerPoint. Um, and then base calm is when we're like fully back to the baseline, whatever that means for the child. But there might also be some of that like collapse that we talked about. There might be exhaustion from how much the nervous system just went through in this crisis. So we just want to think about how would interventions look different at different stages. So these are things that I feel like a lot of you probably already do, like thinking about different just parenting practices that you learn and do. So it can help prevent. Sometimes it doesn't, and like crisis still happens, but we try. We as I've said, we just try our best. So to get into a couple specifics here, starting with positives. As much as we can catch kids being good, there's in couples therapy, there's some, I think it's Gottman's research shows that for a relationship to be like maintained and healthy, any one negative needs to be outweighed with four positives. Like that's the good balance that helps it feel overall positive. So if we think about that in relationship to kids too, which I'm sure it applies to some extent, that like if we're correcting or telling them like something they did wrong or need to do differently, we want to think about how do we integrate genuine and natural, like we don't want it to seem fake, but like specific and genuine positives for what they are doing well, what we're grateful for them for doing, like when they do make small improvements or efforts made, like maybe we told them to go to their room and they took 20 minutes, but they eventually stomped their way over there. We do want to give a genuine, like, that was hard. Thank you. Thank you for doing that. I know that you didn't want to, so appreciate you trying. Um, and trying as much to reinforce the positive behavior as much as we can. Offering choices. When the answer to something is no, try to see if there's a way to make it a yes. Like maybe they can't stay up late watching TV, but what can they do? Are there some good choices we can give them? You can stay in your room and choose a no screen activity, or you can go to sleep. Those are the options. So trying to focus on the yes. And then avoiding back and forths. I like the saying that I've seen in some other therapist's office, but you don't have to attend every argument that you're invited to. I think this is true for kids and for adults we interact with as well. But they even think about the comment about like attachment, attention seeking behaviors, even like that argument that they might get from you of the like trying, they're trying to convince you of something, or like they don't like some rule that you've given or some consequence, and they might still be going at it and going at it. They are getting something from that, some kind of like they're getting your attention. So we want to think about like when we give a consequence, be clear about what it is, but we don't have to engage in that back and forth. Like we can state our piece. They can be upset about it. We can sometimes be a broken record. We can just acknowledge like, I hear you don't want that. I hear you. Yep. That it's hard when you can't do this. It doesn't change the answer. So trying as much to avoid the back and forth that they might say things that might elicit a reaction, but we don't always have to give that reaction. So again, things that I'm sure you all probably do as often as you can. We're still talking about the baseline state of like what to do when things are calm. So I wanted to integrate here some of the thoughts about like when you have multiple kids in the home and maybe some things that we can do to like set up for success when things are calm, like things we can do ahead of time. So some thoughts could be to think about like making spaces in your home. So, like, for example, if you have one child that escalates often, you have other kids that maybe don't, but like they want to be nearby or like it's hard to take care of them. Think about if ahead of time you could prepare like certain spaces that are for them and plan ahead of like what would be in those spaces so that in a moment of escalation, you have some place and thing to direct them toward. You could talk with them ahead of time about how like we have these tools that we can use so that we stay safe, and during tough moments or stressful moments we can go there, and making sure that you attend in some way to them after, also for the kids who aren't escalated, and even for the kids who do often get escalated, maybe having these spaces for them too, especially if they can get some ownership of it, like they can be part of creating it and deciding what they want in it, then they could use that as well. With attachment reactions, some kids might have trouble leaving your side or being separated, especially like if you need a moment to calm down, but they have an anxious or ambivalent attachment, they might want to still be with you even while they're mad at you. So one thought is like if you are trying to have a little bit of distance, think about if there's like phrases or nonverbal communication or things that you and the child can decide upon ahead of time to show that you're present with them, even while you're handling something else. Like when I put a hand on your shoulder, I want you to know that that means I love you and I see you. And maybe that's like the communication. Or if you like have a little handshake, or if there are some words that you can say, like when I tell you, I I love you and I'll be with you soon. I want you to know that that means that I care about you and there's something really tough I like have to do, but I will be with you soon so we can be with this together. Create or gather items that the child can have that remind them of your presence and love that they can put in their calm space, or other people. Like if there's something that you've given them that they can hold. That's their like I know that this means that my caregiver loves me, or cares about me. That's something they could have. And to practice these kinds of things together during calm moments. So I I share everything with a little caveat of like, I know that this might not always work. I've seen kids like destroy their calm spaces when they're upset. And yeah, so then we might have to rebuild it, or like, or maybe they don't want to go there. So like there are challenges that we might face. And a lot of, I think, these de-escalation strategies are like we try different things at different times. Sometimes they work and sometimes we don't. That doesn't mean we have to fully count them out. Like they might have still a space that we can bring in at different times, or try in different ways, and even brainstorm with them if they're old enough of like what might help in the future. I'm going to shift into the triggered state. So when triggers pop up, some things that we can start to do when we notice that there's something getting activated in the child, see if we can tell what the trigger is. We might not know because, like I said, anything can be a tiger, and we it might not be an actual sense of danger. If we can eliminate triggers, sorry, if we can eliminate triggers in the spark, then we can do that. But sometimes the challenge is that the trigger might be like something that they have to do. It might be them going to school, or it might be them, needing to do their homework or something like that. So there's times that we can't. But if there is some aspect of it that we can take out, or that we can shift in some way, then we can do that. We can prevent escalation at this point by staying calm and trying not to poke buttons. I think most of us try not to, but there are times where like if there's a persistent behavior with the child that is difficult, maybe we're like trying to teach them something, we might further escalate by like coming back to a certain thing too much, or over focusing on something that triggers them further. And I think just in general, recognizing which topics like we can come back to. So for example, if it's a consequence, but it's like a delayed consequence, like they can't do something this weekend that they're upset about, it's okay to give them some time. We can talk about this more when we're both calm. And they might still want to talk about it more then. And you can like be present with them and hear them on that, and maybe try to do some redirection, which I'll have some specifics for soon. But just knowing that like we don't always have to have a full resolution in this moment. We might need to come back to it after it's been able to sit for a bit. Um, I feel like another common one, just real quick, is um lying, like when a kid gets put on the spot, like asked, like, did you do this? And their immediate reaction is, no, I didn't. And we know that they did. And then they like dig their heels in more. I feel like that's a good one to like give it some time. Or even if you have to approach a child about like something that they might be dishonest about, starting with a like, today I want to talk about this in a little bit, like this that happened at school. I'm not upset, but I just want to let you know and give you some time to prepare for that. If you want to talk about it now, we can. But if you want some space, then I don't feel like we have to talk about it right away. Like that kind of thing, to like just give a little bit of space. The trouble is that for anxious kids, they might like dwell on that them. So we just figure out what works best for each kid. But I just find that sometimes that step away, they respond in the moment with a lie because that's their like body's response. Like I have to protect myself, but with some more time, we might see more honesty. Um, all right. Once we're getting to the heating up stage, this is when we might have some specific de-escalation strategies. And the book that the crisis curve stuff comes from lists out these three Ds, which I liked. Defuse is trying to like break down the fuse or take it out, but break it down into smaller pieces. There might be a lot that they're getting stressed about. Is there one small thing that we can focus on, that we can help fix right now? One little problem that we can solve together. Try to eliminate or reduce triggers, listen and respond with empathy. And those will be some of the verbal techniques we'll talk about. Try to distract, moving attention towards something, somewhere, or someone else for the moment. When I've gotten called in the past for some of my like most escalated youth, and like the caregiver calls, and yeah, maybe I'll be able to talk to them and like the teen on the phone. Usually I'm starting with just some questions about completely unrelated things. I don't want to know immediately what's going on. How was school? What happened last night? What'd you eat for dinner? What's for dinner tonight? And it doesn't always fully de-escalate, but giving a chance to talk about something completely unrelated can help them just have a different focus and get into a different state and then be able to come into that topic with more regulation. Just use judgment when do it when appropriate, and when like it's something that we can shift to. Sometimes, yeah, that's why I said it's an art and not a science, because we don't always have like a clear and fast of like when to, but there's times where it can be helpful. And then de-escalation, these are some like physical somatic strategies. So temperature regulation, and think about cooling off with temperature. Encourage the, or even just do it with them. Hand wash, cold water, hold an ice cube if they're like connected enough to being able to listen and use a strategy with you. An ice cube calms the nervous system and shifts our state. Same with like cold water. We can do breathing regulation together. We can walk through deep breaths. We can just do them ourselves and show that we're doing that, and maybe they participate. Some of the body relaxation we talked about, doing some stretches, doing some body shakes, things that shift the body in different ways can help shift the aim. Um, and before we talk about the crisis stage, I just want to go in with the reminder that like a lot of de-escalation is about trying to prevent the actual like physical risky crisis. As much as we can before this moment comes, try to do these strategies to prevent it from getting there. And again, some of the nonverbal and verbal strategies that we'll talk about will be helpful at any stage of this. So just a couple of things to like big picture ideas to keep in mind. Like during the crisis peak, if our goal is safety, so coming back to that, like if our goal is regulation and trying to help the child be safe, there's some things that we don't want to do. We don't want to try to rationalize or use logic because in the moment that part of their brain isn't active and they're not going to be able to think as much that way, or it's not going to be as effective. Like they might not be able to hear like what the consequence might be, or that like they know better, like they aren't in that space. So we want to focus instead on using our empathy, using our relationship, trying to support and help calm. Try not to get loud or yell over. Try to speak calmly at an average to soft volume. Try not to argue or convince someone to think differently. This is like going back to the comment about like recognizing that it's okay if the person doesn't realize that we're right, which is hard. But trying to like in that moment, that's not the main priority. At some point, we might be able to come back to that conversation. I think that repair is really important to come back to these things, but just like right now, while we're escalated, that's not priority. Some other things that we should try to not do, and I think that most of us don't, but like sometimes in a moment of stress, we might not, we might know, but then sometimes still do things that again like go are natural, whereas de-escalation is not natural. We don't want to try in this moment to teach a lesson or give consequences. We as caregivers, there's so much to teach and we want them to learn and grow, but we can do that after when things are calm. Trying not to power struggle, trying not to use shaming language or actions. Like I know occasionally I've seen caregivers like film because it might feel effective, like they'll say like they stop doing it once I get out the camera. And at the same time, that's a shame response. And that the like if that gets continues to get internalized of like that then that could be shared with someone and then it's kind of using their emotions as like as a negative. And in that moment they might be out of control, but like shame is powerful enough to snap them out of it. But just be mindful of that kind of impact. We try to not use judgmental language, try not give new information in these moments, make comparisons, especially to like siblings, make threats, block the exit. These are again things we don't want to do. Unfortunately, I've seen that where like things got physical, but it was because like the person didn't want the teenager to leave. When sometimes we might just have to allow that. I'll talk a little bit about like how we assess like what to do when someone might want to leave. But like when we block the exit, then their free flight response might be so strong that then they try to push because they just they feel further threatened. So we want to be mindful of things like that. Um, and if anyone is having moments of like, oh, I've done these things, and you're having your own like response, I've had sometimes people tell me after this training, like one of my therapists said after like she felt bad because she realized that like she was doing something um with her own kids that like brought that she was like, I wish I hadn't done that. And it's like we are also imperfect people and we're gonna do things. And ultimately, like as long as we make efforts to grow and repair and talk about these things with the kids too, then like that's really all we can do. We're gonna have our moments, people, just like they are. Um, so these are different strategies that we can use during the crisis stage to try to shift. Really, a lot of like this de-escalation in a moment of like intense danger and risk is about shifting the environment, the world around us, the world around the child is escalated to change their body and nervous system response into something different. So some examples of what this might look like, and some we've already talked about, but like we can change the channel, change the topic that we're bringing up with them, or that they're bringing up. We can change the environment. Before I was a therapist, I used to be a teacher, and I taught high school, and I would turn off I had like a dimmer light in the room, but I would turn off the light or turn on the light. And just as the classroom was getting like chaotic, that would just shift the environment. And often it would like be an immediate calm. Maybe not forever, but for a moment, long enough to like intervene. Um, change the sounds in the environment, turn off the TV, turn on some white noise, turn on a calming song, change the room that we're in. Some kids benefit from like mints or gum or a favorite candy, a comfort item, a nice scent. I know a lot of it depends on if the child is willing in the moment to engage in something like this. So we might even just bring these things in for ourselves or into the environment and just be curious, see if it shifts anything and offer, see if they'd be open to it. Change the players. I know sometimes you might be doing it on your own, so you might not have a person to switch out with. I know sometimes we might be like I want to fix it, or like they need to, like it's our relationship. We need to be able to fix this. But trying to talk yourself through again, like we can come back to that, but like in the moment, if it's about safety and regulation, having a different person come in might help shift the experience. And they might be able to help the child regulate in a different way than the person that might be upset with. Bring in some different activity. Maybe if we do something together, like suddenly now we have to like grab the coloring things or something that we have like a task, like maybe bring something in and see if that shifts the feeling. Physical outlets, if the person is willing to, like I said, like lifting, walk outside, jump, yard work, like something that might help shift the body's energy. Waiting it out, like giving time and space, silence is okay. It's okay. I've had a lot of sessions where it's been escalated and I've just with either a kid or a teen, like just sat there for a while. And sometimes just that is enough to help them calm down. I know these are harder when you're like, if a crisis is happening when you're like in a rush, like you're trying to get to school or get somewhere, like sometimes we might have to still, if it's like a really time urgent thing, we might have to get there. But maybe there's other moments where we decide like, is safety worth being late today so that we can regulate and have a healing moment and be able to get to the place in a better state. Um, this question I got from caseworkers, but I do think I've had caregivers ask the same thing. So I do feel like it's worth like I still kept it in here to talk about that like when should I leave or get help? I mean, when do you bring someone else? Like when do you call 911 if we're with like a very escalated um child or teen? So first, I just want to define, like when we're talking about leaving, sometimes I've even had to do this in my office. It might mean like stepping out of the space, but being right there, like stepping into the hallway and saying through the door, I'm here with you. I'm here right now. And I want to reconnect when we're calm. Um, if you do feel like you get to a point where you have to step out of the space because things are so dangerous, or even just because maybe you need a breather, if it's a point where it's because of safety, I would just be calling for help at that moment. Like if it's to the point where you don't feel like you can be in the same room as someone, I'd be calling someone. If you do step out, be assessing yourself and the person for calmness for when you can re-engage. Noticing if there's any signs or clues that they're getting calm enough. Like if there was a lot of noise before and there's not as much now, we can use that to check in. And I think sometimes this means like allowing the person to leave. I think a little bit more so with teens, but I have seen, of course, kids who have like elopement tendencies too. But like sometimes we worry about a child's safety and we try to get them to stay in the place that they're in because obviously if they leave, that can be dangerous too. So this needs a constant assessment if we're getting to that point. But one of the things that is helpful to keep in mind is that if we take away one survival strategy like flight, then they might be more likely to engage in a different one like fight. So sometimes it might mean allowing the teenager to storm out, maybe being nearby, like trying to notice where they go. If you've communicated to them ahead of time, like if there's a pattern with this, we might have some communication of like if you return in 5 minutes, then that's okay. If you leave, I'm calling, 911 to make sure you're safe. If there's like dangerous behaviors that come when the child leaves. But it could be a arrangement. I've seen families do this before where they say like, if you're back within the 5 minutes, that's great. If it's more than that, then I'm going to call the police, or maybe 10 minutes or something like that. But having plans, if you know that this is a area of struggle of like what you're going to do and what maybe you and the team talk about ahead of time of how you're going to handle it, because their safety is a concern to you and you want them to be okay and to know where they are. So just a couple more factors to like keep in mind if you're thinking that you might have to like step out. We want to assess like the age of the person in crisis. Like if things get physical, what's the level of damage that the person is capable of inflicting and like what's in their space that could be dangerous. Like in my office, I didn't often have to worry about like any real high level of danger because I didn't have like a ton of like really dangerous objects that could have really hurt things. So if I had like a 5-year-old who was escalated, they could throw stuff around, but there's not any major like real risk of like we're not going to have like a giant thing get thrown at the window or something like that. Um, we do want to assess like what's the potential risk? What's the potential risk to the adult? How dangerous is it right now and how dangerous could it be? And if we're assessing and noticing higher levels of danger, then we would act on that. And assessing our own level of dysregulation. Like, can I help right now? Am I regulated enough to regulate someone else? And if that's the case, we might want to step out for a moment and maybe we communicate in different ways. Like, I love you. I hear you. I need to breathe for a moment so I can help you better. And a lot of these things require our own thinking brain. So that's where like ongoing using our own regulation strategies will help us be able to think through the hard questions of decision making that we may not have access to when we're in fight flight. Okay, so shifting to when we are in during the calming state, continue to implement strategies to create a calm environment. Allow for space and time for these. It can take like 20 to 30 minutes to return to baseline, but that might even be more for a traumatized youth because they might be in that state of distress. So give some time, maybe as you know your youth, you might know if they want you to be present or if they want some alone time. If you can be present together and even just sit in the same space and show that you're with them. You might want to verbally debrief the crisis at some point, but assess for level of readiness. I like to use leading statements to like prepare them, like to say, like, I would like for us to talk about what happened. How ready are you for that? What could we do to make this conversation go well? And then whatever they say. Sometimes I've had teenagers, especially who are like, I don't want to talk about it at all. And I usually like when things are calm enough, I'll talk through at least my perspective of like, that was a really tough moment. I was scared for you, like, especially like I've had like teenagers go on run and I want to talk about it afterwards. Just to say, like, I was worried for you and I want to try to prevent that from happening. I understand it can be stressful to bring back up a negative moment. Um, is there anything, even if we like set a timer for 5 minutes and that's all the time that we get to talk about it, but at least then we identify maybe one thing that can help us or help me help you in the future. Um, and again, like if there was a certain topic that triggered the crisis, like if you had to give a consequence or give bad news, saying like, I want to talk about this again, and I know that last time it was really hard. What might make this easier for us to be able to talk about this difficult thing? See if they have any ideas. You could always come up with a couple of ideas too, like what, and if you notice any patterns that play a role that might help you have suggestions, like what you know might work for your own child. Um, okay. On that section, if there, we'll do question and answer at the end. So I guess if there's any specifically about that, we'll come back to it. But I want to talk a bit about nonverbal techniques and verbal techniques. So can you share in the chat? We're starting with nonverbal. What are some types of body language, things that we show and do that might help a person feel safe? Hugs, smile, relax shoulders, physical touch if they're comfortable with it. I had that same thought about hugs too. Like it probably depends for the child if it helps them get down on their level. Love that. Direct attention, open body, hands down to the side, arms not crossed. Yeah, there's like that open posture that shows I'm present, I feel safe enough myself. Sit down or lay down. I love that. I do that a lot too. Especially with kids, like if I can get a little lower than them, it just immediately shows I'm not a danger physically to you and I feel safe enough to be on the floor and look up at you. And I find that that tends to help. Good. Feel free to continue popping other answers in there. I'm going to talk through. So, with our face and voice, we want to try to appear calm, even if we don't feel calm, which often we don't. But to notice our facial expressions, relax our facial muscles, try to appear non-judgmental and neutral. I will say, like, we want to be with smiling. Smiling typically does calm someone, but of course, we just use judgment too. Like if that might not, like we just want to match. I tend to like try to have my reaction maybe a little bit like dimmer, but try to kind of match what they bring in. If they're distressed, I want to show that I'm with them and I feel that with them. So I might have like a little bit of like the empathy on my face. Um, and gauging what's working. I think that's just a big thing of like how it's an art. It's like a dance. Like if something I'm giving isn't getting taken or it seems to escalate further, then I'm receiving that and I'm noticing that. And now I'm trying to shift into something else and read, just staying in tune, reading. Tone of voice. We want to stay low and monotonous. Don't talk over. Give them the space to share what they're feeling. The louder they get, the softer I get. I used that language earlier of like, I really want to talk about this. I want to talk about it when your voice is as calm as mine so I can hear you. Or I might say things like, it's hard. I really want to listen, but it's hard for me when your voice is that loud. It makes me feel stressed. And I want to be able to hear you the best I can. With our physical stance, some of this was noted as well. Some of you might have experienced, depending on the age of the youth you have, but like driving in the car sometimes is like the best time for a teen or a kid to share because we're not face to face. There's something that like alleviates stress and pressure when like they know they're not going to be like as much looked at, or there's this, like, we're both looking forward. And like, even back when like I said, when I was a teacher, if I had a kid that had to go talk to in the hallway, like if they were leaning against the locker, I would lean against the locker next to them. So I'm not confronting face to face. There's a side to side, like there's a togetherness, and that is just less intimidating. Um, Arms and hands open, easily visible, just showing that we're not a threat. They can just at least reduce that one potential danger if they know where our hands are. Um, one to th- this comment, absolutely. We don't drive with music on, so if conversation needs to happen, I'm able to listen to them. I love that. I feel like it also just allows for space to to learn to be okay with quiet too, which can be hard for kids and adults these days. Um, 1 to 3 feet away might actually be kind of small. I think I meant to change that after the last time I did this presentation. So just be mindful of space. We don't want to be too close. Depending on the level of escalation, we might want to be further back to allow physical space for them. Um, Again, with like knowing our youth, if there are attachment reactions happening, like sometimes your closeness might help regulate, but if there's an ambivalent attachment, like anxious avoidant, where the child like wants you close but then also pushes you away, your being close might also even trigger more. So that's where, again, we're trying to read cues, pay attention to, like, if we step closer and they step back, okay, there's a good sign that I want to, take a step back further. They need some space right now, and to allow that, to just pay attention to what they need. And with hugs, if we know that the child regulates through that, great. If we know that they tend to be sensitive to physical touch and that can be triggering, then we give space. Slow and deliberate movements, do not touch the child. So I kind of already spoke to, like, know your youth. And just non-confrontational approach. So not arms crossed, be aware of our hand movements, try to not talk too much with our hands or flail. Um, so those are our visible nonverbal strategies. Now we're going to talk more about like verbal things that we actually say. So we want to use a soft voice and a calm tone, but what's the actual content? So a question again, what are some verbal statements that might help a child, a teen, someone feel heard and reduce escalation? Some things we can say. I hear you. Try to put into words how they might be feeling and ask them for feedback. Yes. Am I right on this? I ask that question all the time. I'm here to listen. And what that one statement was there, like trying to put into words how they might be feeling and ask them for feedback, that is something that helps bring the thinking brain back online. Because if we're labeling an emotion that they might not have a word for, that helps them have to step a little bit safely into the thinking brain to put verbal content to something and to assess what they feel. So that's good. What else might we say? We ask what zones of regulation they're feeling and build off of that in a conversation if able. That's great. If you have visuals for that in your home, like the different colors, that might even be a way of like they're getting past verbal communication to be able to show. I think sometimes even building in nonverbal ways to communicate about emotions. Like I've seen families make like a cube that has like emotions on different sides of it, and the child can like turn it to show where they're at. Validate them, make sure they know it's okay to have those feelings. Absolutely. Yeah. You can be really mad about this. It makes sense that you're mad. All right, so I'll go through some of the things that you all said, just with some specifics. Allow them to share their feelings. We really don't have to respond to everything that is said. We can answer information seeking questions, and I don't know how often this happens with kids, maybe sometimes with teens or adults, but sometimes with kids too. There could be like hurtful things that are said or questions, and just like, no, we don't always have to answer those. We might have an internal response to them, but we don't always have to respond verbally to things that are said. But what we can focus on, and I'll talk through this in a later slide, is like we can pick and choose what content needs a response. So we can provide support and validation, let them tell their perspective, don't try to argue or change their mind, give them attention, be non-judgmental, and to focus on emotion. So like what we can do is, even if we don't agree with something that's being said, we can validate their feelings without agreeing with the situation. So a child having a meltdown because they can't get their way, like we can say at least like, I bet that feels really unfair that you can't do this. I know that's really not how you wanted this to go. And that's hard. You aren't saying that it is unfair, but you're saying that it feels unfair and that it must be challenging for them. And when they feel heard, sometimes they don't feel like they have to argue as loudly. Like you can say that, they might be able to just be like, oh, okay, she heard me. I'm still going to be mad, but I don't have to keep on trying to be heard. So we can make compassionate comments. That makes sense. It's okay to feel this way. That must be really difficult. This must be hard for you right now. We can empathize with the feeling, but not the behavior. You have the right to feel angry. It's still not okay to threaten me. That's a tough feeling to have. You can feel it. You can't throw things at me. So we can still support a feeling while still setting boundaries and limits for ourselves and our homes. Responding versus reacting. I just like the separating out that language. Like when we're reacting, it's like that initial response that comes out, but a response is a little more thoughtful, where we're not just acting on the emotion. We are taking the step back to assess like what should be responded to. So we can address, like I said earlier, we can pick and choose what to address. So let's say the child says like, I hate your guts, you know I can't do this and you're making me do it, you're so stupid. And if I was reacting to that, I might say back like, don't call me stupid, that's not okay. And then they are gonna be like, oh, I can say whatever I want to say, and then I'm like, we can like really get into that loop. And a part of that there is like trying to teach a lesson, like we're trying to teach kids like to not talk negatively. But that might be part of that like escalation process. If we can take a step back and we still want to talk to the kids maybe later about like, that name calling, that's hurtful. And when you're really upset, I want to help you better be able to express your emotions without using hurtful words. What can we do about that? That's a conversation for when we're calm. In the moment, we might say like, I hear you saying you can't do this work. I hear you saying you hate me and you think I'm stupid and that you can't do this work. So just reflecting what we've heard, or we can address the emotion. You seem really upset right now. Thank you for telling me how you feel. I can tell that this is really frustrating for you. We can do planned ignoring. So we can ignore certain verbal behaviors. So if the kid says like, I hate you, I just want to die, you're so mean, and that all comes out, the statement in the middle is the most important. So we can like ignore the ones on the outside, but on the inside, we want to address like, that's a really big thing that you just said, and that makes me worried. How much are you feeling that? Are you feeling like you want to die right now? And at that point, depending on the age, like and level of risk, like we might be assessing further for safety and how real those thoughts are. Notice what types of comments bring up an internal reaction for you. Try to build in a pause for reflection before responding to those. So if especially like someone calling you some kind of name is frustrating, then those are the ones that we want to be able to pause and develop our own plans of how I'm going to handle that. And again, we might still be able to use boundaries of like, I'm with you, I hear you, that's really hard. It isn't okay to do this. Engaging like in the moment when they might be at a level where they will be able to hear that. Like maybe if they're at a lower stage and they aren't quite as activated, we might be able to better communicate those things. Give choices and control. I talked about this earlier, but like even in a moment of stress, I talked about like giving choices during the baseline, but like giving two great choices when things are stressful. It shifts from a place of threat to collaboration. So try to make sure that if you're giving choices as an option in these moments, that the two choices are things that they actually can do. And you can communicate the impact of behavior to allow them to make an informed choice. So if you continue to do this, I will have to do this. If you continue to throw objects, we will have to leave the store and follow through on it. It shows that we're not being arbitrary. And with these situations, in the moment of like a crisis, when we're communicating a consequence, we're focusing on immediate safety concerns. So not like if you won't be able to go to something like later this week. We're thinking about like in this moment, what has to happen if we're continuing to be unsafe right now to become safe, if that makes sense. And just some mental reminders to hold. Their response is not about us. It is their own trauma system reacting. Try to come from a place of partnership and take their concerns seriously. Ask ourselves, what is their problem right now, and can I help them solve it? People struggle to listen until they think their problem can be solved. And some of the problems may not be solvable, especially if it's like something that they're being told they have to do, but maybe there's a way we can make it better. Like they're being told they have to clean their room when they don't. The problem is that that's going to feel really boring. Is there a way we can at least help that feel more manageable? Or maybe they're being told to do homework and it feels really overwhelming. Is there a way that we can make that feel better? And that comes back to knowing our kids because they might not in the moment be able to communicate that. Our goals are we just want no one to get hurt. We want to try to avoid police involvement if possible. But it is okay if they're not happy. That isn't always the goal here. Like it's okay if they're still upset about something. What time is it? I will just briefly touch on this part. Just with verbal aggression is complicated because it's not always like there isn't always a risk that comes with it. Like if someone's making threats, there's different levels of threat there. So really we want to in the moment like be able to step back and assess level of harm. Like at the bottom here, a threat without credibility, like they're making a threat, but it's like, I'm going to throw you off a bridge. That is not a immediate, like, there's no immediate threat of harm there. But threats with credibility, where like there is a means of threat in that moment, that's where we're responding with safety precautions. We're making an exit plan for ourselves. We're using surroundings as barriers, trying to, call for help if we need to. So we're assessing like the level of actual risk that comes with verbal aggression. Some things for physical aggression. Tell the person for this might be a little bit less applicable for a young child, but like the person can leave instead of being aggressive, or another alternative, like what else can they do instead of throwing something? Is there something else they can throw? Can they throw something in the backyard or downstairs or something like that? Use surroundings to create space and distance. If someone's getting physically aggressive, keep your hands in front of you and back away if possible. If you need to like defend yourself, be direct with exactly what you want. Matthew, stop pushing me. Use their name for the connection. Don't block their exit, and leave the space if you need to and are able to for your safety. So it's like if someone's like starting to kick, punch, throw. All right, I will briefly touch on problem solving and then we will do Q&A. So just want to leave you with the thought that like when the logical and thinking brain is back online, then we can talk together about about where we go from here and what we do with this difficult situation we just had. I think that the debriefing process can be really helpful to repair any wounds between you and the child, and also like help plan for a better future. And this can be done together, or like if there's a therapist involved, they can help with that. We might problem solve questions like what can we do to help you get through tonight? If we're like after a crisis, who can we utilize to help you stay safe? What was different about this situation that made it harder to manage? What's helped you now get into a better state? Like what's helping you be calm now that we can use? And ultimately, like we might just want to loop in other people to help us be able to prevent future crises. So if there's consistent struggles, we might want to think about, is there a counselor who would get involved? Are there people from the school that can be helpful? And like if it's a school related trouble, they have trouble when they're leaving school or something or going to school, who can we partner with to help problem solve? Utilizing caseworkers who are involved and know the child, and any other friends or family members that like in a moment of crisis, if we know that there's an aunt that's helpful, can we like make kind of some safety plans of like maybe we call that person during stress to be helpful, and to help them regulate. So I'm going to share some final thoughts and then we can shift into some Q&A. I need to keep in mind that your work has a ripple effect. So even if you have like a child or a teenager who like isn't making change on their own, you doing things creates change in a system. You bringing in this knowledge, you responding in different ways, any kind of change in a system creates overall change. Something that worked for you today might not work for you tomorrow, and something that didn't work today might actually work tomorrow. So ultimately, a lot of this is about building up your toolbox, knowing yourself, knowing your youth, and trying strategies, maybe revisiting old ones that didn't work before and troubleshooting like what didn't work about that, just to not count them out. I do like to note that sometimes if we try to create change in a system, the desire for equilibrium from a youth might lead them to react in bigger ways. So if it is like some kind of limit setting, or like if you've reacted a certain way before and they're expecting that reaction, they might try to do things to get that reaction. So it just sometimes gets harder before it gets easier, which isn't fun to say or know, but it can be helpful to like to trust the process that by making these changes, if you can overcome that difficult hurdle, then you and them will relearn a new way of responding. Um, if this felt like a lot, maybe just identify one tangible takeaway that you can apply this week, and then maybe come back to the PowerPoint and pick a new one for the following week. If this felt like things you already knew, then I at least hope that something felt like recentering for you of like at least coming back to what you know to be true and what you're already doing, or feeling encouragement in what you're already doing. And if you are still feeling discouraged, seek help. Talk with your caseworkers who are involved, or talk with like local community agencies for individual counseling, either for you or counseling for the child, or family counseling, just so you don't have to go through it alone. Okay, so I think that's my final slide. So I'm going to stop sharing and then we can shift into some Q&A time. You're muted.